Hi everyone, my name is Ellie, and today my project will be a multi-layer analysis of the effect of zoning laws and neighborhood influence on the gut microbiome and cardiometabolic health of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders living on Oahu. So to give a little bit of background, cardiometabolic diseases, or things such as heart disease, cancer, and type 2 diabetes, have become a major public health concern worldwide. As you can see from this graph, 2.1 billion, or nearly 30% of the world's population, suffers from obesity, which is a major predictor of many of these cardiometabolic diseases. And as you can see, the United States is disproportionately affected by high rates of obesity. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders suffer disproportionately from these cardiometabolic health conditions compared to other major ethnic groups. As you can see from this graph on the left, taken from the Hawaii Department of Health, comparing the overall state of Hawaii to the Native Hawaiian population, you can see they suffer from a much larger rate of coronary heart disease, stroke, heart failure, and cancer than the general population, which culminates in a 3.32 higher diabetes mortality rate than the rest of the population and a 50% obesity rate compared to the national average. So Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders have also been historically underrepresented in biomedical research, and that causes a really big research gap where a lot of population health studies that look at minority populations don't have specific evidence for Native Hawaiian populations, and that makes it really difficult to implement policy. So the other aspect of my research is the gut microbiome, which has emerged as one of the most critical determinants of health. So the gut microbiome is related to things such as acne, all the way to cancer and heart disease. And it's also been noted as a driver of pathology. So as you can see from this graph on the right, there is a research study conducted by Peter Turnbull, which he implanted the gut microbiome of an obese mouse into a lean germ-free mouse, and that mouse actually became obese. And the gut microbiome of a lean mouse was implanted into a germ-free lean mouse, and that mouse stayed lean. And this was considered very novel in terms of gut microbiome and in terms of treating therapies through the gut microbiome, just because it found that it's a driver of pathology and really representative of your health. And the gut microbiome and population health is also shaped primarily by environmental factors. So, in a study published in the highly peer-reviewed journal Nature that correlated 241 host and environmental factors, including physical, mental health, and socioeconomic factors, it was identified that the gut microbiome is shaped by primarily these environmental factors. Only 6.6% of the gut microbiome bacteria was actually heritable, whereas 48.6% of it was coming from the environment. And not only that, but they also found 7,519 associations between the gut microbiome, diet, and socioeconomic status. So in terms of spatial location, as you can see from the picture on the right, research has found that increasing green spaces and walkability has an effect on population health, specifically cardiometabolic health. So the purpose of this research is to target the gap in population health research for Native Hawaiian populations on Oahu by examining the effect of zoning laws and neighborhood influence, which is variables such as the median income in the area where you live, on the gut microbiome and cardiometabolic health of Native Hawaiians using a combined geospatial and biomedical approach. So my first research question deals with zoning laws, and the question is, how do zoning laws affect the cardiometabolic health of Native Hawaiians? My second question deals with the gut microbiome, and it looks at how are neighborhood influence and zoning laws related to differences in Native Hawaiian gut microbiome relative abundance and diversity compared to white and Asian populations on Oahu. And my third question deals with neighborhood influence. So what is the association between neighborhood influence and the prevalence of obesity, diabetes, and hypertension in Native Hawaiians? So the two measures that I'll be using to quantify cardiometabolic health are A1C, which is a simple blood test that is taken over the span of 3 weeks to be used as a biomarker to diagnose whether or not you have diabetes, and then body mass index, which is a commonly known indicator for cardiometabolic health. And for neighborhood influence, the specific variables that I will be looking at is educational attainment, quality of life, the median individual income in the area where you live, the employment rate in the area where you live, and the housing ownership availability in the area where you live. So to introduce the data and to investigate these questions, I collaborated with the Mauna Kea lab to analyze the data set that they had collected of 547 individuals that were enriched for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. So using the language R in RStudio, I plotted all their individual geospatial locations on this map, where each red dot represents an individual and then overlaid census tract, which is represented by the blue lines, in order to determine the census tract information associated with each individual. Each census tract designation is what I use to represent neighborhood influence. So if a person lives in that region, the median income value, for instance, associated with that census tract would also be associated with that person. So what I did with the census tract information was I conducted backwards principal coordinates analysis on the census tract variables to determine the final index of variables using a margin of error that was associated with each variable to determine a final index that was actually representative of what was going on in the study. And using that, I created two weighted indices, one for education, which took all the education from kindergarten to completing your PhD, and then an index for quality of life, which is this new variable that has been coming up in the literature that is used to represent things that are not a direct reflection of socioeconomic status. For example, do you take public transportation to work? So to investigate my first question, which is how do zoning laws affect the cardiometabolic health? What I did was I divided individuals into four spaces. So green spaces, industrial, residential, and urban using the zoning code that was available and affiliated with the Hawaii GIS website. And what I found was that Native Hawaiians consistently exhibited poor health outcomes, regardless of the zoning residence area where they were living. So you can see the Native Hawaiian trend line is represented by the red bar charts, and you can see that their A1C and BMI levels are consistently the highest compared to the other races across the board, regardless of which area where they lived. For the gut microbiome, to see how neighborhood influence and zoning laws are related to differences in relative abundance and diversity compared to white and Asian populations. You can see that Native Hawaiians had less diverse gut microbiomes than other races, and Prevotella as a distinctly most abundant gut microbiome. So what I found was that people who lived in residential areas actually had more diverse gut microbiomes, and typically having more diverse gut microbiomes is associated with overall better health. And this may been attributed to the fact that these people who lived in these areas may have had access to a more diverse array of foods. And Native Hawaiians specifically also had less diverse gut microbiomes compared to other races. But what was interesting was that this was also tied with the highest abundance of Prevotella, the bacteria associated in their gut microbiome. And so what the literature found was that most indigenous populations had Prevotella distinctly as the most distinct gut microbiome in their bacteria, but that was also associated with having less diverse gut microbiomes. And so that may be associated to cultural factors, cultural eating habits, or perhaps socioeconomic reasons that would cause that paired but high abundance of Prevotella, but also with less gut microbiome diversity. My third part was analyzing the neighborhood influence or the association between neighborhood influence and the prevalence of obesity, diabetes, and hypertension in Native Hawaiians. And so the first thing that I looked at was educational attainment using the educational attainment index that I'd created. And what I found was that Native Hawaiians experienced a disproportionately greater worsening of health in neighborhoods with higher educational attainment levels. So the axis on the bottom represents your neighborhood average educational attainment level. So like how many people in the area where you live have PhDs, for example. But this interesting paradoxical trend emerged where actually BMI and A1C went up as the area where you live had a greater number of people that had high levels of educational attainment, which you would expect them to go down and health to improve with this. But the reason this is because this is a neighborhood representation of educational attainment and not an individual one. And so each data set, each point was associated with self-reported data of educational attainment level for that individual. And when I looked specifically at the data set, I found that Native Hawaiians on average had a much less lower educational attainment than the other populations. And so based on this graph, even though the neighborhood area reflects that there's a high level of educational attainment, the Native Hawaiians living in the area didn't necessarily have that same level of educational attainment, even though the neighborhood area reflected that. And so their health did not follow positive trends as you would expect. So specifically looking at the specific types of education, more Native Hawaiians had doctorate's degrees, so this was actually representative of the BMI. And you could see that having a doctorate's degree and a bachelor's degree in your area actually improved the BMI and A1C for Native Hawaiians. And so what was significant about this was that having levels of higher education, such as access to a bachelor's degree or a PhD, actually had resulted in an improvement on health, whereas just completing a GED or just having base high school completion actually did not have a positive effect on your health. And so that shows the importance of higher education. So the next variable was quality of life. And so what I found was that as the quality of life increases in a neighborhood area where you live, health improves for Native Hawaiians. And like I said, these variables are not direct reflections of socioeconomic status. And so targeting things such as increasing access to public transportation to work, for example, or carpooling, making it easier for that would have a positive effect on Native Hawaiian health. So these are some of the variables that were within that index. And so all the graphs that I'm posting were statistically significant. So what was interesting was that as the median individual income where you live increases, you can see that BMI improves dramatically for Native Hawaiians, whereas there's only slight fluctuations with the other races. And this was really interesting, which is because it shows that if you apply the same resources to try to increase the median individual income of Native Hawaiian populations, it would have a really positive effect on their health compared to if you use those same resources for, say, someone of a white or Asian pop descent, which you can see that their health is not as affected by this variable. And another interesting thing was housing ownership. So as you can see, all the other races were affected by the housing ownership variable except for Native Hawaiians. And you can see, so what this shows to me was that there may have been something barring Native Hawaiians from having access to housing ownership and perhaps generational wealth accumulation that the other races may have had that Native Hawaiians may not have had, which caused them to not have access to owning a house, which in turn made their A1C levels not at all affected, either positively or negatively. And so what that showed was that there's a really large gap in terms of improving access to housing ownership here that should be addressed just because their health was not at all affected. So for conclusions in terms of zoning in the gut microbiome, as we said, Native Hawaiians exhibited poor health outcomes and less diverse gut microbiomes, regardless of the zone where they lived. But the populations who lived in residential areas had greater gut microbiome diversity. And what that showed is that we should make efforts to improve gut microbiome diversity. And one way to do that is actually through the zoning code. So one way would be to include mixed use zoning instead of just having like single family or single family zoning areas, which means that you would allow for the building of like grocery stores, for example, in residential areas where people would live, and changing the zoning code to make it more walkable would also make it easier for Native Hawaiians to have like spatially have access or to get to places that provide a diverse array of foods, which may improve their gut microbiome because as the research showed, Native Hawaiians consistently had the lowest gut microbiome diversity compared to other races. But this may also be attributed to socioeconomic reasons. So along with spatially changing the zoning code, there should also be support for food assistance programs such as SNAP, and also place-based investment tax credits to help businesses to incentivize them to build their businesses in those areas, or to incentivize job employment that would increase access to having a more diverse array of foods. And for neighborhood influence, what I found was that increasing educational attainment and quality of life has an outsized positive effect on Native Hawaiian health. And Native Hawaiian health also improved distinctly with the increased median individual income compared to other races and was unaffected by the housing ownership variable. And so that specifically what this shows to me is that we should develop Native Hawaiian specific health education and lifestyle interventions, as you can see on the left. So research has shown that that a major reason that many indigenous populations attribute to health is not having the knowledge or the resources to know how like type 2 diabetes occurs, for example. And so having culturally sensitive programs that don't take the Western approach, but are conscious of like Native Hawaiian culture, but that also address these critical gaps that many research has shown would help to improve population health. And as the research shows, addressing educational attainment specifically is really important, and then increasing access and increasing income levels. But also, most specifically, there is a gap with home ownership. So increasing home ownership is a really important thing because their health was not at all affected. So currently, there's the Department of Hawaiian Homelands that sponsors the Homestead Act, which is supposed to give out land to Native Hawaiians so that they can live. But currently, there's major opposition right now in the legislature where they want to give out cash handouts instead of giving out leases. And there's also a really long waiting list. 2,500 people are on the waiting list, and there's many caveats that make it really hard for Native Hawaiians to have access to owning a home. So all these like legislative funding, legislative support, maybe testimony would help to improve access to home ownership, which, as the research showed, is a major gap that should be addressed. And overall, in terms of conclusions, you could see that Native Hawaiians were much more sensitive to neighborhood variables than other races. You could see their trend lines were very distinctly different from the other races and at much higher thresholds. So that if you use these same policy interventions in these areas, it would have an outsized positive effect on Native Hawaiian health compared to if you use those same resources on someone of a different ethnicity or race, just because the health is this way for Native Hawaiians. And so another thing that can be done is to improve the healthcare system or improve healthcare access for Native Hawaiians. As you can see, the US has the most expensive healthcare in the world compared to other top income countries, but they don't rank the same in terms of quality of healthcare delivered or affordability or accessibility. And as you can see also, the poorest income decile spends the largest amount of their income on healthcare, 35%, whereas as the income deciles, as families get wealthier, they spend a much smaller part of their income on healthcare. And so for Native Hawaiians specifically, you can see from this graph, rely on Medicaid and Medicare a lot for their insurance coverage. And so this shows that increasing access to things such as ACA are really important. Like as you can see in 2010, Obama passed the ACA, and then what this did was that in 2010, the uninsurance rate was 17.4%, which dropped to 9.9% in 2015. And so specifically, and what this did was it banned saying that you can't give access to people because they have pre-existing conditions. And Native Hawaiians, as we saw from the research, have a disproportionately higher level of chronic diseases and pre-existing conditions. And so specifically targeting on insurance and increasing access to insurance is another way that you can be involved to help improve population health for Native Hawaiians. And so what I learned was that and advice to future students is that you should keep pushing and not give up, because in research you'll reach a lot of roadblocks and a lot of things that you didn't expect. And even if you come up with a plan of how you want things to go, sometimes they may not be that way, but it could be positive because you learn something new. And I also learned to stay organized and consistent despite those roadblocks, so that you can go back and really understand like what you were doing and what you learned. And also for future students to research something that's important to you and interests you, because that's really what's going to get you through your research and push you towards your research journey. And I just wanted to give a big thank you to everyone who supported me, Dr. Fan Kitnarendran, my mentor, and Dr. Perez David. And thank you, Dr. Chan and Mr. Hill and Mrs. Kobayashi, for all your support, and my family for all your support and guidance in my research journey.